Hi guys, how old are you? I'd love to see the age range of our viewers. Write your age below.
You ever found out your whole family went to paradise and you were the only one not invited? Not because you were out of town, not because you had a falling out, not because you couldn't afford it or said no, but because someone decided you didn't fit the vibe. That's what happened to me. And I didn't find out from a phone call or a heads up or even a lazy group text. I found out from Instagram. There they all were, my mom, my dad, my sister Rachel, and her husband Todd. Even our cousins from Arizona I hadn't seen in over a decade. Smiling under palm trees, drinks with paper umbrellas, sun-kissed and barefoot in the sand. And me, I was sitting in my living room, sipping reheated coffee, thinking they were somewhere local on a small family trip, just like they told me. The thing is, they didn't lie outright. They called it a small trip, just a few of us. My mom said it in passing, like she didn't want to bother me. "We're doing a little weekend thing," she said. "Probably just Rachel, Todd, your dad, and me, maybe a couple cousins, close circle." When I asked where, she waved it off. "Not far, just a beach rental, low-key. You'd be bored, sweetheart." I remember laughing. Me bored at the beach? I'd been the one organizing barbecues, game nights, cleaning up after every holiday dinner like it was my unpaid job. But whatever, I figured. They want quiet, they'll have it. I told them to enjoy. I even sent Mom a little cash via Zelle to cover drinks. And then 5 days later, I opened my phone to check a text, and Instagram slapped me across the face. It wasn't even Rachel's post that hit first. It was Marcy, our second cousin who barely remembers birthdays and never shows up unless someone dies or gets married. Her caption read, "Family trip of a lifetime. Thank you, Rachel, for organizing this amazing getaway." There were 12 people in the photo. 12. They'd rented a damn beachfront villa in Maui, full ocean view, pool, spa, even a fire pit. They'd taken a group photo at a luau, and not one person had thought to ask, "Where's my sister?" Not one. I sat there staring at that photo for a long time, not crying, not fuming, just stunned. Like I'd stepped out of my own body and was watching someone else's life fall apart from across the room. I didn't comment, didn't call. I just scrolled. Picture after picture, Rachel in a flower crown, Mom with a drink in each hand, Dad wearing a Hawaiian shirt that I gave him for his birthday last year. The cousins I barely speak to jumping into the pool like we were all one big, happy, connected family. Except I wasn't in a single frame, not even tagged in a joke. I was invisible. It took me 2 days before I finally called my mother. I didn't scream, I didn't ask why. I simply said, "Hope Hawaii was worth it." There was a pause, just a breath of silence. And then she said, "Honey, it wasn't like that. We didn't think you'd want to come. Rachel said you were too busy with work." Too busy with work. That's the sentence that did it. That's when something inside me cracked. I work remote. I literally own my schedule. I've bent over backward for this family more times than I can count. When Dad had surgery last year, I moved into their house for 2 weeks. When Rachel had her second miscarriage, I was the one holding her at 3 in the morning. I've given money, time, patience. I've been the bridge between fights. The one everyone calls when someone's in trouble. But I wasn't good enough for a beach chair in Maui, I asked her, straight out, who decided not to invite me. She hesitated, and then gave me the answer I already knew was coming. Rachel said it might be too much drama with that many people. She thought it'd be better to keep it simple. So my sister, the same sister who once locked me out of my own car when we were teenagers because she thought it was funny, decided that I was too much. And Mom and Dad went along with it. Like it was nothing. That's when it changed. That's when I went from hurt to cold. I didn't hang up angry. I said thank you, told her to enjoy the rest of her vacation, and hung up. And then I opened my calendar. Not because I had plans, but because I was about to make one. You see, Rachel and her husband Todd, they've been living in the guest house behind my place for over a year now. Rent-free, utilities covered. I told myself it was temporary, just until they got back on their feet. Todd had lost a job. Rachel was dealing with emotional burnout, whatever that means. I let them stay. I even bought them a new microwave last month when theirs broke. But if I'm not part of this family anymore, then neither are they. And they were about to find out exactly what that meant. I sat back, looked out the window at their little place, lights still on, probably blasting central air I pay for, and I smiled, not because I was happy, but because I finally stopped making excuses. And if they thought Hawaii was expensive, they were about to learn what betrayal really costs. There's a particular kind of silence that settles in after a betrayal, not the loud, dramatic kind with screaming and crying and shattered plates, but the kind that hums low, steady, like a bad frequency only you can hear, playing under every normal moment until it infects even your breathing. I wasn't angry the way people expect. There was no scene, no meltdown, no drunken voicemail at midnight. Just a very calm realization that something fundamental had shifted. Something in the way I looked at my family, like the lens had finally cracked and I could see, for the first time, exactly how little space I was ever really given in that picture they called us. I didn't act right away, not because I hesitated, but because I wanted it to land right, not with fire or fury, but with precision. So I waited until they got back from Hawaii, until the tan lines had barely started to fade, until the photos stopped getting likes, and their little vacation glow wore off, and life slipped quietly back into its regular rhythm. That's when I printed the 30-day notice to vacate, walked across the lawn, and slipped it under the guest house door without a word. I could have texted, I could have made it dramatic, but I didn't owe them a performance. I owed them an end. The thing is, they didn't even react right away, which honestly made it worse. Rachel sent a lazy text the next day, something like, "Hey, is this for real? Thought we were good staying here till October." As if this arrangement had been set in stone, like I was just a side character in their financial plan. I didn't respond. I let it sit. Let her feel that silence I'd been living in. A few days later, Todd cornered me in the driveway with that usual smug, tight-lipped smile that he always wears when he's trying to seem reasonable while actually telling you you're being ridiculous. He leaned on the hood of my car like we were old friends and said, "Hey, I know you've been under some stress. Maybe we could all talk. Smooth this out." Smooth what out? The months of free rent? The utilities I'd paid for while they got back on their feet? The way they tiptoed out of my life and into a luxury Hawaiian vacation while pretending I just didn't want to come? I told him politely, clearly, and without a tremble in my voice, that the guest house was being renovated, and they needed to find other accommodations by the end of the month. Period. He laughed a little, like he couldn't believe I was serious, like he was trying to charm the tension out of the air, but there was nothing left to dissolve. I was done. And when Rachel came storming into my kitchen that night, skipping any kind of hello, her voice high and brittle with that mixture of shock and entitlement only she can pull off, I just looked at her, really looked, and said the words that had been waiting inside me for years. "You don't get to take from me and then cut me out when it's convenient. Not anymore." Of course she cried. Rachel's always been good at tears, not the ugly kind that come from actual pain, but the theatrical kind, the ones that make people lean in and pat her hand and say, "She's going through so much." She cried about how they didn't mean to leave me out, how it was supposed to be just a quick thing, how she didn't realize how hurt I'd be, as if my feelings were some distant optional consequence, like a forgotten jacket on a trip she never planned to take me on. She talked and talked, throwing words like bandages, hoping one would stick, but I didn't flinch. I told her 30 days. That's what the notice said. That's what the law said. And that was all there was to it. But I guess the rules don't apply to people who've spent their whole lives being shielded from consequences. Because 2 weeks went by, and nothing changed. They were still in the guest house, still running the AC like they owned the place, still parking like it was their driveway, still living off my good graces as if nothing had happened. So I did what any landlord would do when tenants overstay their welcome. I went to the circuit breaker and shut everything down. Water, power, internet, gone. It took exactly 12 minutes for Rachel to come pounding on the main house door, furious, screeching about how it was illegal and dangerous and how she had rights. I opened the door calmly, let her say her piece, then handed her a printed copy of their guest agreement. The one she never read, the one that clearly stated this was a temporary living situation under my full discretion. She stared at it like it was written in a foreign language. She threatened to call Mom and Dad. I told her to go ahead. She could call the Pope for all I cared. But if she wanted to keep the lights on, she better start packing. Of course, that was the moment my phone began buzzing. Mom first, then Dad, both calling back to back. Then a long text from my mother filled with guilt-laced questions. What's happening? Why are you doing this? Can we talk? And the longer I stared at it, the more I realized that none of this was about Rachel alone. It was about the whole damn dynamic. The way I was always expected to be the solid one, the helper, the fixer, the support beam they could lean on while they planned vacations without me, and then still expected me to keep the roof over their heads. It wasn't a break. It was a fracture that had been there for years, finally wide enough to walk through. So I texted back, just one message, and then I blocked them both. The message said, "You chose your favorite child, let her house you." Then I stood by the window and watched the guest house, lights out, fans silenced, the whole thing quiet for the first time since they moved in. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel cruel. I felt like a woman who finally stopped holding a wall that wasn't hers to carry. But of course, Rachel and Todd weren't the type to take things lying down. I knew something else was coming, something petty, something entitled, and I was ready. Because revenge wasn't just a response, it was a rebalancing, and I was just getting started. There's a particular moment, a quiet second that follows an act of deliberate retaliation, when everything feels weightless, almost suspended in time, as if you're standing on the edge of something irreversible and yet perfectly balanced, a rare intersection between justice and personal satisfaction. That was the feeling I had as I stood in front of the breaker box, flipping each switch down one by one, with a kind of calm that doesn't come from rage, but from absolute certainty that the people on the receiving end had earned every second of discomfort they were about to experience. The lights in the guest house blinked off, the hum of the air conditioning cut short like a throat being cleared, and with it, so did my patience for the games they'd been playing under the veil of family loyalty. I'd given them 30 days. I'd followed protocol. I'd been fair, more than fair, considering they'd lived in my space, without rent, without gratitude, and clearly without the decency to include me in the very kind of family event I used to organize myself. And yet, when those 30 days passed without so much as a cardboard box packed, I realized that they had no intention of leaving quietly or respectfully or at all. They decided they could outlast me, that if they pretended hard enough that nothing was happening, I'd fold first, because that's what I've always done. I've always been the one who backed down, who kept the peace, who made room for their excuses and egos, but not anymore. It didn't take long for the consequences to kick in. Within minutes of the power cutting out, Todd came stomping up the porch like a man who thought he still had leverage, his voice raised but his words measured, like someone trying to sound legal without actually knowing the law. He accused me of overstepping, of abusing my power as a landlord, a phrase I'm certain he'd Googled 15 minutes before stepping outside. He tried to corner me into a conversation I didn't want to have, using that same smug reasoning he always relied on, thinking if he sounded calm, I'd feel irrational. But this wasn't irrational. This was mathematics. 30 days had come and gone. Utilities I paid for were being used by people who treated me like background noise in their curated little life. That equation had a simple solution. I stopped paying. When I told him flatly that the power would stay off until the place was vacant, he threatened me, not loudly, not overtly, but with that passive-aggressive confidence that people like him mistake for power. He said, "I'm not sure if you realize how bad this could get for you, legally." And I smiled, because I had been waiting for that exact moment. I had already spoken to a lawyer friend 2 weeks prior, A favor returned from an old college connection, and I knew exactly what lines I could walk. And more importantly, I knew what Todd was hiding. You see, Todd likes to play the financially strapped good guy, the husband with bad luck, the well-meaning victim of a tough market. But 2 years ago, I happened to see an email on Rachel's iPad while she was showing me photos of a new sofa they wanted. It was an application one Todd had submitted to refinance a rental property he quietly owned across state lines, a property he never disclosed to the family, probably because it would have ruined his carefully constructed narrative of being broke and burdened. At the time, I didn't care. I chalked it up to privacy. But now it felt like ammunition. That night, I reached out to a friend who worked in real estate. A few hours and a bottle of wine later, I had a document in my inbox that told me everything I needed to know. Todd had misrepresented his income on mortgage paperwork for that property. It wasn't just shady, it was potentially criminal. And he'd done it under the assumption that no one would ever bother to check. After all, who would question a struggling husband living in a guest house on someone else's dime? The next morning, I sent an anonymous email to the bank handling that mortgage. I didn't say much, just included the property address, a few relevant figures, and a note suggesting they might want to review the loan documentation. I didn't sign it. I didn't need to. Sometimes the truth is enough, all on its own. By the end of the week, Rachel and Todd were scrambling. I overheard a phone call. Rachel pacing outside, her voice tight with panic, as she talked about needing to fix the paperwork and find a lawyer. Todd wasn't smug anymore. He looked like a man who'd just realized he'd been living in a glass house, and I'd been quietly collecting stones. Meanwhile, my parents had begun circling back in full force. My mother left a voicemail every day, always starting the same way. "Honey, I just don't understand." As if confusion was a get-out-of-jail-free card. As if she hadn't been a full participant in the exclusion. As if choosing Rachel over me was just an accident she hadn't meant to make. My father finally texted, a simple line that read, "Let's be civil, we're still family." And that's what broke me. Not the betrayal, not the silence, not even the insult of being lied to, but the assumption that I was supposed to be the one to smooth it all over in the end. Family doesn't mean enabling. Family doesn't mean allowing people to disrespect you just because you share DNA. Family, at least how I once understood it, was built on something deeper than blood. It was built on trust, reciprocity, and a willingness to show up for each other even when it's inconvenient. What they had shown me was that I was optional, disposable, and when people show you that, truly show you, you don't argue. You believe them. So I blocked my parents, not out of spite, but out of necessity. I didn't want to hear the apologies they hadn't earned or the half excuses dressed up as remorse. I needed peace, and I needed distance. Because something told me this wasn't the end. Todd and Rachel weren't going down without throwing a tantrum. And my parents? They weren't done playing referee, pretending they could fix things with a family dinner and a few guilt-tripped tears. But what they didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I wasn't trying to win anymore. I wasn't playing their game. I was rewriting the rules. And the next move, that one was going to hurt. There's a certain kind of poetic satisfaction that comes from watching people who've lived their lives without consequence finally stumble over the mess they've made, especially when that stumble comes not from some vengeful strike, but from the quiet unraveling of a carefully constructed lie. And as I watched Rachel and Todd's facade begin to crack, not from one big explosive moment, but from the slow, tightening grip of their own missteps catching up to them, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt vindicated, not because I wanted to see them suffer, but because for once, for the first time in what felt like years, reality was actually reflecting the truth I had seen and felt all along. When the bank began asking questions, it didn't take long for the storm to follow. Todd received a call, then an email, then another call, and I could hear the panic in his voice from across the yard as he tried to juggle half-truths and invented figures over the phone, pacing the gravel like a man trying to hold up a house of cards in a windstorm. And Rachel, oh Rachel, she went from indignant to despondent within days, crying not because they were victims, but because the performance wasn't working anymore, because the sympathy she'd come to rely on, The endless well of patience and forgiveness that she had exploited for years had finally run dry, and for the first time, she was being seen exactly for what she was: a user, a manipulator, and above all, someone who had never been asked to take real responsibility for anything she'd done. They left the guest house not with a bang, not with any kind of self-awareness or apology, but with a heavy silence that said more than any words could have. They moved out 5 days past the final deadline, slamming doors and packing boxes like martyrs, like victims of some cruel injustice, as though being held accountable for freeloading in someone else's home was somehow beneath them. And as I watched Todd struggle with a poorly taped cardboard box marked kitchen stuff, I found myself thinking how poetic it was that a man who had lied to a financial institution and squatted in his sister-in-law's backyard without remorse was now forced to carry his own damn blender. But of course, the saga didn't end there, because nothing in this family ever ends cleanly. Not a week after they left, my parents showed up on my front porch, without calling, without warning, as if the fact that they had given me life somehow entitled them to walk back into mine at their convenience. And when I opened the door, it was like staring into a memory I didn't recognize anymore. My mother stood stiff, lips tight, eyes searching mine like she was trying to find the daughter who used to let her get away with everything, while my father hung back, his hands tucked deep into the pockets of his windbreaker, like he knew he had no right to speak, but couldn't bear the silence. I didn't invite them in immediately, not out of cruelty, but because I needed to see if they would ask. They didn't. My mother launched straight into it, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and disappointment as she said, "I can't believe you would let it get this far. That you would do this to your own sister." And for a second, just a second, I almost laughed. Because it wasn't what I had done to Rachel that surprised her. It was the fact that I had stopped playing the role she'd assigned me decades ago. When I finally opened the door and let them step into the kitchen, into the home I had paid for, renovated, maintained without their help or approval, I didn't offer coffee or tea or a chair. I stood across the counter from them, arms folded, and I told them everything, not in anger, not as an outburst, but as a carefully constructed recounting of every time they had asked me to be quiet, to be patient, to forgive, to step aside so Rachel could have her moment, her needs, her breakdowns and breakthroughs, her endless parade of wants dressed up as emergencies. And as I spoke, I could see the denial melting slowly off my mother's face like ice under a heat lamp. I told them how it felt to find out about the Hawaii trip through social media, how the betrayal didn't come just from Rachel's manipulative suggestion to exclude me, but from their silent agreement to go along with it, how they had looked at that plan and thought, yes, this makes sense. She won't mind. She won't ask. She won't matter. I told them about the guest house, about the notice, the utilities, the lies, and when I told them about Todd's mortgage fraud, my father finally looked up, not with outrage, but with something close to shame. But what surprised me most wasn't their reaction. It was how little their reaction mattered to me anymore. Because as I stood there, pouring out a decade of quiet resentment, of overlooked contributions and unreciprocated care, I realized I wasn't doing it for them. I was doing it for me, not for some cathartic release or dramatic confrontation, but because I needed to say it aloud, needed to hear the words come out of my own mouth so I could finally believe that none of this was in my head, that I hadn't imagined being the forgotten one, the fallback, the one who was only invited when it was convenient or necessary or someone needed a ride to the airport. They didn't apologize. Not really. My mother murmured something about not realizing, and my father said, maybe we made a mistake. And that was it. That was the sum total of their remorse. And when they left, it wasn't with a hug or a promise to do better, but with a heavy silence and a faint bitter, take care, as though I had been the one to destroy something sacred. And maybe I had. Maybe I'd burned the last bridge connecting me to the version of my family I used to believe in. But as I stood at the window watching them drive away, I didn't feel grief. I felt clarity, because the truth, the raw, unfiltered truth, was that I hadn't lost a family. I had lost an illusion. And illusions once shattered don't deserve rebuilding. There's a strange stillness that follows a storm, not the kind you hear about in poetry, where everything feels reborn and the air smells like redemption, but the kind that feels hollow and unfinished. Like something important has been knocked loose and no one knows quite where it landed. That's what the house felt like in the weeks after Rachel and Todd left. Quiet, yes, but not peaceful. More like the silence that settles after a fight where nothing was truly resolved. Just silence long enough to make everyone retreat to their corners. And in that silence, I sat, not triumphant, not broken, just adrift in the reality that for the first time in my adult life, I had stood up for myself with a clarity so sharp it had sliced through every tie I had ever thought was permanent. At first, the aftermath didn't look like anything dramatic. There were no dramatic apologies, no sudden attempts at reconciliation, no grand gestures to undo what had been done. Rachel went dark on social media, which for her was the digital equivalent of a funeral. Todd vanished from view, presumably dealing with the financial mess that had started to unfold the moment the bank began poking holes in his mortgage paperwork. Word reached me, through mutual acquaintances who didn't realize I was on a self-imposed family blackout, that they had moved in with my parents, setting up shop in the same guest bedroom I had once painted yellow when I was 16 and convinced I was going to become an artist. The irony wasn't lost on me. How quickly the favored child found refuge, how readily my parents folded their arms back open to her even after everything, because no matter what Rachel did, there was always some excuse waiting to be offered up like a shield. I didn't hear from any of them directly, not at first, not until a week later when a letter, not a text, not an email, but a handwritten letter, arrived in my mailbox, addressed in my father's tidy, careful script. It wasn't long, and it wasn't dramatic. It was almost surgical in its emotional restraint. He said he hoped I was well, that he understood I was angry, that maybe time would soften things, that family should mean something more than hurt and misunderstandings. And as I read it, seated at the same kitchen table where I had stood to confront them just days earlier, I found myself questioning something I hadn't allowed myself to face in all the righteous fury of my boundary setting. What if I had gone too far? Not because they didn't deserve it. They did. They earned every ounce of discomfort I delivered. But the question that sat on my chest, heavier than any revenge, was whether in choosing to be the person who finally said enough, I had become the person they could now call heartless. Not just selfish or dramatic or difficult, but heartless. The villain of the story they'd now get to tell, with Rachel playing the long-suffering sister and my parents as the confused, heartbroken guardians of a fractured family. That thought didn't break me, but it lingered, and I couldn't ignore it, especially not after I heard that my father had suffered a panic attack just days after our last encounter. It wasn't serious, nothing life-threatening, but serious enough for my mother to leave a voicemail, tearful for once, not to guilt me, but to simply say that she was scared and she didn't know how to fix any of it. And maybe she never would. That message stayed in my phone for 3 days before I listened to it all the way through. And when I finally did, I didn't cry. I didn't call her back either. I just sat there with the weight of it all pressing against the part of me that still remembered birthdays and Christmas mornings and the smell of my father's cologne when he hugged me after my high school graduation. Because it's not that I didn't love them. I did. I still do in some quiet, distant way that doesn't make sense anymore. But love, I've learned, doesn't mean you have to set yourself on fire to keep someone else warm. That night, I found myself scrolling through the Hawaii photos again, not to punish myself, but to see them with different eyes. I looked at my mother laughing in the sun, at Rachel holding a cocktail and posing like an influencer, at my father in his Hawaiian shirt smiling faintly behind his sunglasses, and I tried to figure out what was so unbearable about my presence that they had chosen this instead. Was it that I reminded them of their obligations, that I was the mirror they didn't want to look into? Or was it just easier to pretend I wouldn't care, because I had never made a scene before? And maybe that's the question that will never be answered. Maybe that's the scar that will never fully fade. Not the betrayal itself, but the not knowing. Not knowing how long they'd planned it without me, or who first said, "Let's not invite her," or what silence followed that moment when no one objected. It's the silence that haunts me more than any words they could have spoken. So here I am, alone but not broken, stronger maybe, sharper, less willing to entertain the fantasy. That family always means safety. I've cut the cords, closed the doors, shut off the utilities, literally and emotionally, and now I live in a house that echoes when I walk. But at least it echoes with truth. And yet, even now, part of me wonders what comes next. Not because I regret what I did, but because there's a fine line between self-respect and self-isolation. And I can't quite tell which side of it I've landed on. The house is quieter now. My phone no longer lights up with messages that drain me. My days stretch long and undisturbed, and sometimes, in the dead middle of one of those days, I catch myself thinking, did I win? Because revenge is easy, it's clean, it feels good in the moment, like scratching an itch that's been festering under your skin. But living with the aftermath? That's murkier. That's where the real story starts. I haven't unblocked them. I haven't reached out. I haven't walked back anything I said or did. But I have started sleeping better. And I have started wondering whether, if the roles were reversed, if I had been the one caught laughing on the beach while my sister sat alone at home, they'd have burned their own bridge too. Or if they would have just smiled through it, swallowed it, and moved on. And maybe that's the most unsettling part. Maybe I'll never know. I still don't know who I hurt more, them or myself. And that question, unlike the breaker switches and eviction notices, doesn't come with an off switch.